Welcome to this Rayworth's Harrogate Literature Festival event. It's part of the Harrogate International Festivals, and we are really, really pleased that Rayworth's LLP solicitors, a local firm, as I'm sure you know, are yet again supporting the festival. It's more important than ever this year. And if you want, by the way, to contribute to the festival, to Harrogate Festivals, you can go onto the website because these events are free. My name is Matt Stadlen, and I am a presenter, I'm a broadcaster, a producer, and a writer for my sins. And I'm absolutely delighted to be interviewing for the very first time in my interviewing career, Jess Phillips MP. She is a hero to many. She's the MP for Birmingham Yardley. She's been that since 2015. And she's also under Sir Keir Starmer, as of this year, the Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding. She is someone who really does stick up for the underdog, and she does it without any airs and graces, without any sense of pretension. But she also does it really articulately and really powerfully. And therefore, who better to write a book about speaking truth to power than Jess? She's written this book, Truth to Power, and I'm going to have to swear, sort of, just briefly. It's how to call time on bullshit, speak up, and make a difference. Jess, it's really good to have you with us.
Oh.
I'm going to let everyone into a little secret, just to make this even more informal, and that is that we've already done the first five minutes of this interview before, but I forgot to press record.
It's much better. I did a whole podcast recently, and at the end, the woman was like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't record it." And when you go on Question Time, there is 5 minutes at the end when you're on Question Time where they say, "We're just going to check that recorded because it's an hour earlier than it's aired." And I think, well, I'm not doing it again. I'm not going through that again if you didn't do it the first time.
Oh, can you imagine if we'd got an hour in? It was just a disaster. When I was younger, because of my ginger hair perhaps, and my sensitivities, I used to blush. And my mum once left a little note under my pillow when I got back from yet another unsuccessful date and saying, "Don't worry, darling, about the blushing. It's a good sign. It's a sign of sensitivity," or something like that. And it kind of helped. And I don't think I'd blushed for years, but when I realised that I hadn't pressed record in our first ever interview together, I did blush.
Well, don't worry. I'll send you a small note. In Parliament, we really trade on small notes. Everybody sends around like little notes on this little portcullis thing. So I'll send you a small note that says, "Don't worry. It's a sign of humanity that you made a mistake. We all do it."
And you are in Portcullis House right now, aren't you? And the internet seems to be holding up all right.
Yes, just about, although it will be a matter of minutes, I should imagine, before it doesn't. It cut out on me constantly yesterday, and so we're just hopeful that it will last, I'm afraid. And also you may well hear bells, because it used to be that bells meant that there was a vote. Now it means that somebody's cleaning something. So when they're in between any debate in the House of Commons at the moment, they have to clean the dispatch box, because in the early days of coronavirus, ministers of state were literally riddled with the virus. So they now have to clean the thing in between every session in Parliament. There's about 4 debates today, so the bells may very well ring. Just ignore it if they do.
It's such a strange story. I mean, it's in a way, and maybe we'll look back on it and we'll have a different perspective. It won't seem quite as huge a story as it does and has for the last few months, but it's such a big story because it involves all of us, doesn't it? It involves me as a journalist, it involves you as a politician. We could all get it. We're all subject to the same restrictions. I mean, it's just an enormous story.
It is, and you could never have imagined it before it happened, that there was something, especially in my line of work. You feel you're constantly fighting the case in front of people, so the government, or even your own party, the case of your individual experiences or the experiences of the people that you represent. And it's very, very hard often to get people to understand, to get Boris Johnson to understand what it's like to be benefit dependent, or to get, a man to understand what it's like to be a woman in the workplace. But this is, it is universal. And actually, it's only sort of for want of a better word, I'm not sure it's the word Rishi Sunak could use, but sort of like a socialism about it, that we're all involved and we're all going to have to be involved in making it better and recovering from it in the future. But it's so random that my life experience is almost exactly the same as the Queen. She was locked up in Balmoral. I was locked in a considerably smaller house in Birmingham. But, you know, we're both like not able to see our families, and we're both in the same boat.
One of the things I wonder whether you find challenging is with power, and this book is so much about how we deal with power and speak truth to it. With power, the more powerful you become, in a way, I imagine, the more remote you become from the people that you are supposed to be representing or championing.
I think
I wonder how difficult that's for you. You're not in power, but you are an elected representative serving lots and lots of people, and you're able less to get out and about and meet them because of the restrictions.
Yeah, it's the hardest thing about the restrictions is the inability to go around the country, but also just be in my constituency and be in with the people who I represent, who are the absolute best part of my job. I mean, they're also the hardest part of my job, but they are the absolute best part of my job. And I do feel, I've started to feel, because we normally, on any given day, I would spend 3 days in Westminster and 3 days in my constituency office, which is an open office, and people can come in and talk to me about, and come in they do, and talk to me about all of the issues that they face. And then I'd go door knocking on a Saturday, and, you know, you'd be hearing things. I've started to feel remote from reality, but I think everybody feels a bit remote from reality. But yeah, as you rise up the ranks, I have to say, I think it is one of the best things about the British democracy, and it is almost completely unrivaled in the world. I think Ireland is not dissimilar, but other than that, it is unrivaled, that there remains a constant thread between politician and the people that they represent. You know, most politicians undertake surgeries every week at least, if they don't have an open office like I do, and most people go out campaigning. Theresa May remained having constituency surgeries all the way through her time as Prime Minister. One of my friends went to interview her for a book, and she was like, "Oh, I'm sorry, you're going to have to cut you short," because she was in like Maidstone Town Hall, and there was a queue of people waiting to talk to her about their paving stones. So, you know, there is something really, really charming about the British democracy in that regard. There's a bloke who lives in my constituency. He'd come from, I think, Guyana, and he joined the Labour Party, and he came out door knocking with me one time, and he could not believe that I, as the Member of Parliament, was walking up and down like a street on an estate, just knocking on people's doors, talking to them. He was literally like, where I come from, people would just drive past you in a blacked out SUV. It's amazing that you do this. And it is unrivaled, I'd say, in the world, the British democracy, for that reason. And so at the moment, I think that it feels very much like very powerful people have the whip hand, because it feels like Parliament is neutered. For me to represent what my constituents are saying, it feels like there's far fewer opportunities and far less appetite to listen to us. We've gone from having a hung Parliament, where obviously my vote mattered just as much as the Prime Minister's, to a majority government. But to be fair, their own side are kicking off about how they're not listening to them as well. But also, I don't feel like I'm properly representing people in the way that I would like to, as well. So it does feel a little bit like, in times like this, we have to be really careful that very, very powerful, despotic people don't take advantage of it.
Well, I wonder what you make of I mean, we're recording this a little before the festival, but I wonder what you make of these latest regulations, latest laws, like on the statute book, that haven't been properly scrutinised by Parliament, that haven't been voted on by Parliament. Now, I'm someone who thinks we should take this disease very seriously, of course, but there's something that I find quite uncomfortable about the idea that a local council, I believe, can appoint an officer to use reasonable force to make sure that someone who should be self-isolating, and obviously they should be self-isolating, I don't work from that at all, but that they are self-isolating, which just picture the scene. That means that a local official can see that someone on local intelligence or whatever should be self-isolating and isn't, could go up to them in the street, presumably, and physically get them back into their home. I mean, this is dystopian, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how quickly my son was my son was had his bubble at school. He went back to school for something like 8 days, and then his bubble, somebody was tested positive, so he was sent home for a further 2 weeks. But because he's got no symptoms and none of us were showing any symptoms, I tried to get a test to see if, like, you know, he was asymptomatic. We didn't qualify to have a test. And we were told to just go about our business, but try and keep as best distance we can from him in the house. And what you've just described, and that experience that I had with my son, it's amazing how quickly the pandemic went from being a moment where we all come together and act with consent in the best, and we're trusted to act in the consent with the best interest of our community, to lock your son in a room and put pizza under the door and grass on your neighbours. It's gone. It seems to have happened quite quickly, and I think that partially happens because the vast majority of the British public are going to do exactly as they've done. My son hasn't left the house for 14 days. He's also not washed, as best I could tell, but he's just there doing his Zoom lessons. But the vast majority of people are going to completely and utterly abide by the rules. And there are some people who are not going to, and there's absolutely no doubt there is need for legislation to ensure that they are. But we seem to have lost the idea of the consent of us all wanting to do it and seeming to do it. And I think that, personally, I would put that down to the fact that we don't trust what the government is telling us. And so unfortunately, throughout the crisis, there has been a number of different pitch points around care homes, around schools, and around universities this week, around the A-level results, where it just felt like we could see that something was going wrong. And we were grown up enough to hear that something was going wrong in an unprecedented time. But instead we were told, everything's fine, we've put a protective ring around the care homes, test and trace is going to be the best in the world. Nobody wanted it to be the best in the world. I just wanted it to be bang average. I will take mediocre but operational over best in the world. And because there is this breakdown in trust that has happened throughout the crisis, I feel that that's what's ended up with what is essentially can be considered, and I'm sure it won't be happening as you know, in the worst case scenario, it just won't. But has led us to a point that for many seems very draconian.
It's a wake-up call, this crisis, isn't it, in so many different ways, not least about our vulnerability as a species, if we're looking really big picture. But if we look at power, which is the focus of your book, written before coronavirus, it just reminds us, doesn't it, these rules that are being enacted in an executive way, so without parliamentary involvement, without a parliamentary vote anyway. It just reminds us how quickly democracy can break down. So when we think about Boris Johnson illegally proroguing Parliament, I mean, the Supreme Court decided he hadn't actually prorogued it at all because he wasn't allowed to. But if you think about that, if you think about assaults on the rule of law, if you think about populism and all of these things, and you remember that people say, speak up against this, whatever your politics, because you don't want one day a government that you don't believe in, that you don't support, to have the power and then to misuse power. I mean, the fact that Boris Johnson can now executively lock us in our homes should remind us of how important it is that we have proper checks and balances in our society, and that power doesn't sort of gather in a cluster at the very top.
I mean, absolutely. It's terrifying, actually, how quickly democracy can, and, you know, it's not just what we've seen with all the examples that you've given, but just in history, how quickly the idea of a representative democracy, which I believe is a flawed but the very, very best system that exists, can be taken away. But actually, in my opinion, in this instance where it feels as if Parliament has been totally neutered, and it genuinely does feel like that. It feels as if these laws are passing. Normally, when you pass a law in this country, it takes about a year, and it is endless debate. You have pre-legislative scrutiny, You have endless debate. You have committee after committee. Then it will go over to the Lords. It's a long and drawn out process. Sometimes too long and too drawn out. And no one would expect that same timescale during a crisis, understandably. But some dialogue, some communication, because actually the people who live in Surrey and Uxbridge may have a very, very different life experience to the people who live in Birmingham, Yardley, who live in Bolton, who live in all the areas that, funnily enough, are currently locked down. That there needs to be that to and fro. And at the beginning of the crisis, I have to say, I felt it much more. So when they said we're going to have to close schools and people are going to have to work from home, there was a huge amount of debate, statements, questions, answers. There was a phone line put in place for politicians to speak to different ministers, to make sure that in speed we could make sure that we could iron out some of the inevitable problems that would happen because of people being living on welfare, people whose grandparents are child carers, that sort of thing. There did seem to be much more of a spirit about it, and now it does just feel like decree, do as we say, and that's it. I mean, the vote that we're going to have today, in fact, is that literally you can't amend, it cannot be amended. It's take it or leave it. And that is no way to govern, in my opinion. The other problem that you have, and the people who are responsible for it, in my opinion, there's a very few people who actually have the power to change what is happening with the sort of undermining of democracy, and that is the cohort of Conservative MPs. They can say no to Boris Johnson. We can say no to him, but there aren't enough of us to say no to him, and that's on our backs. You know, we deserve to sort of pay for some of the reasons why there aren't enough Labour MPs. But there's about a balance of about 90 people who all agree with what you just said and what I just said. They might not agree with me on many other things, but they do agree and they believe in parliamentary democracy. But they will just trot through the lobbies because power corrupts. Power makes you think, well, if I don't do this, then I won't get this job. I don't want to put my head above the parapet. And these are people I like and respect. And when I see them in the corridors, they are diminished in my mind.
I want to draw a connection with what you just said and how difficult it can be for people in everyday circumstances to speak up. And that's the thrust of the book. But first of all, just on this idea that you can find yourself with unlikely bedfellows when you have an all-enveloping crisis like this. It's similar in a way to Brexit. You have people on the left and right agreeing with each other in one direction or another. And so with this, you could find yourself left-leaning, but agreeing with Tory backbenchers who might be ardent Brexiteers, but who think that parliamentary democracy needs to be respected.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I went on the television the other day and you always have to get like a Labour and a Tory, and it's like, oh, we'll get the sparky ones because they'll fight with each other. It makes good telly. It was me and David Davis, a man who I could almost certainly only find less than a handful of things that I would agree with him on. And we just totally agreed with each other throughout. So, yeah, you know, on the Brexit debate, I found myself completely on the opposite side. On almost every other debate, maybe civil liberties is not so bad on. But
he resigned, didn't he? I think
he did.
Champion civil liberties, which was really impressive.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'm not of the opinion, and I've never. Well, actually, not never. Actually, I was raised to be of this opinion slightly, but I'm not of the opinion that I can't find bedfellows with people who are who have completely different ideological dint to me. I also don't believe that people are either heroes or they belong in the bin. And one of the things I was trying to say in the book is that people are made an exception of the rule of exceptionalism to say, oh, look at this person, she was a hero, look what she did, like Rosa Parks, look at this amazing woman who did this amazing thing. But she was a great woman and she was brave and she did an amazing thing. She was no more a hero than anybody else could be in her situation. And also, I'm sure she probably had downsides. I don't believe people are either heroes or they belong in the bin. And so I think that you should try and find a way to work with people from all walks of life, because I was raised to believe in equality and tolerance, and I feel politics is one of the most intolerant areas. You know, if you were to talk about somebody's beliefs and feelings in the workplace, in any other workplace, say their religious beliefs, in the way that we talk about each other's ideological beliefs in this place, you'd definitely be facing some form of tribunal.
I'm so curious to know where you draw the line in terms of trying to find the good in people, because it's such an important quality. Mm-hmm. Ian Dale, who's a presenter on LBC, where I was myself until very recently, he's written a book about getting along, why we should all get along, basically, or why can't we just all get along? And he's very good at building friendships with people, or at the very least dialogue with people on the other side. It's something I did on my LBC show for 4 years. I really wanted to give people who disagreed passionately with me the chance to have their say, unless they were racist. I would try and end on a good note. And with you, when you see you passionately going for Boris Johnson in the House of Commons, I'm so interested to know what it's actually like when you guys pass each other in the chamber, or pass each other in the corridor or whatever. Like, can you at the same time feel so strongly that he's bad news for this country, but also kind of get on, or is it about civility? How does it work?
You can get on, is the truth, and I have had moments of complete civility with Boris Johnson, and sort of stood with him and sort of, when I say complete civility, and this is something that I think is admirable about a person, the way, I don't know whether it's being from Birmingham or just my family, or the way I was brought up, the way that I show kindness and affection to people is often to take the piss out of them. That's what my dad always used to say. I'm only really awful to the people I really love.
Well, you haven't insulted me yet, so that makes me very worried.
Give it time. So I will, when I interact with him, I am always taking the piss out of him, and him me, when we're being civil with each other. It would be like, I will take the piss out of him. So I bumped into him once in the lobby. It was on the day of the private members' bills, which is the sort of lottery day where members of parliament write their name in a book next to a number, and then a number is picked out of a bag, and that's whether you get to change the law or not. It's the way to run the country, people. I bumped into him in the lobby where people were signing up to it when he was the Prime Minister, and I said, because it was when it was a hung parliament and he couldn't get anything through, and he was just ripping, it was really hard. And I said to him, you're signing the private members bill, is that the only way you can change the law? I bet you must really love being Prime Minister. Is it everything you thought it would be? And he sort of like, we will laugh with each other about those sorts of things. But then there are times when I bump into him in the corridor and I tell him off, and I will say, and it gets harder and harder and harder. The worse he behaves, I feel, the harder it is for me to act with civility towards him. But I wouldn't be rude, I wouldn't be aggressive, but I also wouldn't look at him in his position and think that I didn't have a right to go up to him in the corridor and tell him what I thought and what I thought he was doing wrong. And I've done that on a number of occasions, walked up to him and just said, I think you're totally out of line. This is terrible. What you're doing is wrong. I don't feel that because he's the Prime Minister, I can't walk up to him in the corridor. He's just my colleague.
I wonder, though, whether people can, to what extent people can be marked by something that they've said or that they've done, whether it's so beyond the pale.
Oh, they can.
Because, you'd look at Boris Johnson, Jeremy Corbyn, when he was leader of the Labour Party, I don't want to go into too much detail about that, and these people are not here to defend themselves, of course. But I as a lifelong Labour supporter, I couldn't vote Labour under Corbyn. I certainly didn't vote for Johnson's Conservative. I couldn't vote for Labour, and that was painful, twice in a row. And so there's obviously fault on both sides of the aisle to different degrees.
Of course.
But if we focus on Boris Johnson just for a second, what he said about some Muslim women who wear the hijab, I'm not even going to repeat the phrase because I think it's so damaging and unhelpful. But that was so offensive and so calculated and so dressed up, in my view, by saying, oh, well, people should be allowed to wear this, and sort of dressing himself up as a liberal, but at the same time making a deeply offensive remark. You know, it just makes it harder, doesn't it? I am someone who always wants to try and shake, in pre-COVID times, shake hands with people. I don't believe, unless it's the most egregious circumstances, people are going to peddle hate and stuff, that you should no platform people. But I mean, how do you... how do we work out as human beings? Because there's so many people who would follow you on Twitter. You have 400,000 plus Twitter followers. And they will be, they hate Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of them. They despise him. And so they might find it quite difficult to understand how somebody who speaks to them can hang out with him, or not hang out with him. But you know, I'm not advocating that you shouldn't. I'm just pressing the question.
No. I think it's a totally fair question, and I think that there are things that go beyond the pale. But you have to, I suppose, be mindful that it is my place of work, and that for me, the most important thing is not how I feel, who I want to be friends with, or what power it gets for me. It is the outcome that I am striving towards. So if I were, you know, if actually it would suit my cause of getting better services for migrant victims of domestic abuse, for example, to ignore Boris Johnson, to be awful to him, to slag him off to his face, and sometimes that is what it takes, then that is ultimately what I would do. But the reality is he has the power, and I need him to be shamed, charmed, embarrassed into giving me the little bit of power I need for my cause. And I will skin that cat accordingly. I hate what he said about Muslim women. In fact, one of the times I had a go at him in the corridor was about that. He was going to Birmingham to the Labour Party, to the Tory Party conference, rather. We don't have them in Birmingham. It's really annoying. And I said, I hope that Birmingham gives you the welcome that you deserve. I hope that the good women of Birmingham tell you exactly what they think of you when you get there. And frankly, I'm going to speak for Birmingham when I say you're not welcome there. So I did, you know, but I fight the war I have, not the war I want. The war I want is where people like Boris Johnson, and it's not because of his ideology. His ideology is different to mine, and I think it's wrong. But I wouldn't mind if I even thought that Boris Johnson believed in it. The reason I dislike deeply Boris Johnson is because he will say and do things that are hurtful for the outcome that is about Boris Johnson. So he's fighting that war. He's trying to get attention for Boris Johnson always. He has no great vision for the kind of Britain he wants to live in. He has no desire to make things better for people in our country. He has a desire to shock, divide, and make things better for Boris Johnson, in my opinion. But he's the fella I've got to claw power from to help the people I want to help. I always say I would dance with the devil to make women and children safer, and I would. And so if that means in a working environment, not acting like an arsehole to Boris Johnson and being reasonable with him in the corridors, then that is what I will do. It's not about me.
Can I push it just one stage further? As someone who I work for the BBC, first of all, I can feel my old BBC hat return. Even in defence of Boris Johnson, who's obviously big enough and strong enough to look after himself, and as the Prime Minister, I could say, should just say, obviously, he's not here to give his view, and he'd say he has this vision for the country and so forth. But I just wonder whether, if we're really, really brutally honest with ourselves, whether it's goes even further than that. You know, I wonder whether it's really just about you wanting to get the outcomes which you do for the people you care about, which of course you do, and of course you care about them.
Yeah.
But I wonder whether it's even something sort of more fundamental than that we are all human beings, and that we can recognise humanity in each other. I mean, I've interviewed people like Trevor McDonald and Mark Austin and all sorts of journalists John Humphreys and others, who have Jeremy Vine, who've met good leaders and bad leaders. I mean, we're talking broad brushstrokes.
Yeah.
And I'd be surprised if one couldn't find humanity in the most unlikely places.
Of course, I think I can't remember. There's a story. I think it was like Saddam Hussein or somebody loved HP sauce, and my husband always says that whenever he gets the HP sauce, because it's from Birmingham. He's like, well, you know, he got that right. He loved HP sauce. There is, of course, in almost all people, there is an element of. There could be an element of fondness found. I genuinely believe that. I don't want to believe that people are born evil. I think some people are incredibly selfish and vicious and vile. And I have this struggle quite a lot in domestic violence services and sexual violence policy, because we can all now, post Me Too, even before that, but post Me Too, we can all now accept that we know somebody who has been raped or sexually abused. We've learned to say it and make power out of the fact that we have shared experiences. Different vulnerable groups have shared experiences. But what we're not yet doing as a society is recognising that if we all know somebody who's been raped or sexually abused, then we all know a rapist and a sexual abuser. And that we might still like them. And we might still think that what they've done wrong is abhorrent and awful. But you genuinely don't get to decide and choose that you still love your son or you still love your dad. I've watched kids on the stand testifying about their fathers who've abused them, saying that they loved them, saying, but he's my dad. And we have ended up in society where people are either the Antichrist or they are Christ. And nobody can live up to that. I literally can't think of a single person who could live up to that standard. And I'm not saying that we should tolerate violence against women and girls. I've dedicated my entire career to saying the entire opposite. But until we accept that we know people who might have done bad things, we're never going to end it. We're always going to go, well, that happens to somebody else over there. And so I believe that people who do bad things are sometimes really good as well. I've struggled to find the good thing that Boris Johnson has done. But I'm sure he's a cracking company. I don't know. He will have a redeemable feature. I don't know him well enough to say what that is.
This idea that we're not all bad, any of us, and we're not all good. I mean, it's a very strong argument against the American judicial system. Are we going?
Too bloody right.
Sorry?
Too bloody right. The American judicial system is the craziest thing in the world.
The idea of just throwing away the key and with it throwing away hope. And if you throw away hope, you kind of throw away humanity. And it's the idea, to use that word I use, that people are not marked by one thing they've done. And obviously repeat offenders and so forth, but people are more complicated than that.
Of course they are. Of course they are. You know.
And understanding that is important, I think, to generating change. As you say, if you can see the humanity in someone, you can appeal to their better side.
Also, one of the best ways to generate change, in fact, the only way you could ultimately change anything, not change anything, but take anything from power. Power can change whatever it likes, whenever it likes, and we just have to live with that. But the way you can change your power imbalance, the only way you can do it is if you bring people along with you. And if the starting point of bringing people along with you is some sort of purity test, then expect to change nothing.
Can we talk a bit about how everyday people can change things? So people who don't have your platform or don't have the platform I had at LBC, how do you make change happen? And how important, because you touched on this earlier in a slightly difficult, how important is motivation? You write about the importance of getting it right in the book.
Can you hear the bell? Let me just check I don't have to vote. Nope. No message from God on my phone to tell me to vote.
Sounds like you've transported us to a Swiss mountain. The cowbells. Herding you all into the lobby. Motivation matters, you say in the book.
It does. It does. It's the single most important thing, actually, I think, in deciding whether you're going to sort of take the dangerous and frightening step forward into trying to change something, is what is your motivation to do it. And of all the people I interviewed in the book, and of pretty much every example I can think of where things changed, the motivation was to stop a thing happening to other people, to stop a bad thing that you had experienced or witnessed or known about happening to other people. And there's quite a distinct difference to seeking revenge. So there are people, I interviewed Zelda Perkins, who worked for Harvey Weinstein, and well, we all know how that ended. And she spoke up on behalf of somebody else. Her assistant had accused him of sexually of attempting to rape her, and the thing for Zelda, it hadn't happened to her so directly, but the thing for her was, we've got to stop him being able to do this to anybody else. And she spent 25 years basically trying to get to the position where we are now, where Harvey Weinstein is thankfully behind bars, and that it was uncovered and that he wouldn't be able to harm anybody else. But it was never about hurting Harvey, is what she would say. She would say it was never that I wanted to get one up on him. I wanted him to feel the pain that he'd caused me and my friend. It was always, we've got to find a way to stop this happening. Because what I have seen from being a constituency member of parliament or working in women's aid is, when the driving factor is, I want to get somebody back for hurting me, which I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, because in lots of these cases, in the case of Harvey Weinstein, who could blame somebody for feeling like that? Somebody was so powerful and could belittle so many people to such a point that they were silenced for decades. Who could blame somebody for being like, I want you to rot in jail? But ultimately, if that is the reason, the motivation that you step forward to try and change something, it will be unsatisfying, because you can never undo the thing that has been done. And I meet people who are whistleblowers in government departments or against institutions, institutional sexual violence in children's homes and things I've met. And I watch people be eaten away and driven mad by that. And so the motivation to change things so it doesn't happen again, whatever it is, good, bad or ugly, that is the thing that I would say. If you have that feeling that you just don't want it to happen again, that's the platform to take.
You mentioned actually Doreen Lawrence in the book, and Stephen Lawrence's father, and I hope I'm not misremembering this and therefore mischaracterising, but I think I heard him speak. It may have been David Lammy speaking about him speaking and the influence it had on him. I'm not sure, but I get the impression that he has somehow been able to forgive, or to move on from the anger and whatever else he must have felt at the brutal, racist murder of his son. And what I remember from that is that if you don't do that, then you are trapped in it yourself.
Totally. It's like drinking poison every day and expecting it to kill your enemy, and that is. And I feel that way. I suppose that's why I can walk around the corridors and be okay with Boris Johnson, because hate will only hurt me, and it does. It eats you up. And sometimes I can feel myself sat in the chamber of the House of Commons, and I can feel my fists literally, and I can feel like my nails digging in, and it hurts. It
almost looked like you were on the point of tears at one point.
I feel physical pain at times with anger and aggression, but that won't make them listen to me. That won't make it work necessarily. I mean, sometimes it's helpful to rally people to your cause. I'm not saying it doesn't have a place, but ultimately, if your motivation is just to get somebody back, similar to Stephen Lawrence's father, in the Birmingham riots when we had the London riots, the Birmingham riots a couple of years ago, there were two young men killed in Birmingham. In the fracas, a car drove into them, and they were two young Asian men, and they then community spiked tensions because of that happening. And the day after his son had been killed, Tariq, a man who I now know and love, took to the streets and said, "Don't do this. Like, I forgive that this happened." And I just remember thinking, how could you find that in yourself so soon after, because you care about your community? And that is heroic. And he's gone on to, found youth charities, refugee agencies. He's an amazing bloke. He was just a bloke whose son was killed in the street. I think that if your motivation is good and it is external to your own emotion, then you probably will be able to change things. Otherwise, you might just send yourself completely crackers.
You talk in the book, Jess, about the difference between stepping up, the decision that people make, between stepping up or staying silent. And often staying silent can feel like you're protecting yourself, but in the end, you might often be harming yourself and harming others like you. You say that people could be sparked into action, sparked into deciding to step up and make their voice heard by direct involvement in an incident.
Yeah, usually. I mean, in most cases where, sort of the fabled stories where people are, finally enough is enough sort of thing, is usually because of their own personal involvement or the involvement of somebody that they love. Like the Grenfell Tower is a good example of a group of people who are just getting on with their lives, forced into action by incidents in their lives. Doreen Lawrence, similarly.
Natasha Elcock, who you interview, I mean, she says herself, doesn't she, I think, that she's not particularly political. But
God, no.
The fire sort of almost forced her to get to know how politics work.
Absolutely, and to have an idea of the perception of people like her and her community, which she said she never felt before. When I interviewed her, she said, suddenly people were talking about us in this way, and I just had no idea anybody thought any, because I was just like, going to work and carrying on and making sure the kids had clean clothes for school and things. She was like, I never thought I was in a category, or I was just Natasha, and then I was this political force with a platform. And it is amazing how something happening can make people just suddenly be like, right. And I think it can happen to anyone. I don't think some people are. I mean, I've met lots of useless people, don't get me wrong, but I think everybody has the capacity, if faced with what is an unimaginable injustice, to stand up and say, do you know what? I'm not going to take this anymore. I'm not going to take it.
So let me ask you this, because I used to try very hard to stick up for people who were being bullied at school, and that often meant that I was bullied more intensively than I was otherwise. There are plenty of reasons why people bullied me. And not defending
they're blushing, etc., etc.
All that kind of stuff, yeah. Endless. Anyway, I've sort of mostly not found it that hard to stick up for someone who I feel is an underdog. And it can be quite hard as a man, because especially if you're quite a big bloke, but that brings into the possibility of physical violence against you, because people might feel threatened by you, by your intervention in a way that they might not usually by a woman intervening. So I've sort of got in between people when they've been having fights down the road on Ladbroke Grove or whatever it is. But I'll give you two examples, one in which I think I succeeded and one in which I think I failed. And I hope by addressing the way in which I failed, you can sort of enlighten sort of. So I was at Twickenham watching England play rugby, and the referee Nigel Owens is a gay man, and I heard someone behind me shout what I thought was homophobic abuse towards him. Now, whether or not they knew that he was gay or whatever, it was unacceptable. So I turned around and said, keep your mouth shut or whatever. That sort of language is not accepted in this stadium. And he did shut up. And then at half time, the steward came up and thanked me for doing the job for it. But so that was a sort of relative success. What I find harder, and if I saw racism, I'd find it equally easy, I hope, to stand up against it. What I found harder occasionally is the sort of low-level, everyday, insidious sexism that you experience. And I'll give you a hypothetical example. Let's say we're doing a Zoom event, and I'm about to interview a bloke, and it kind of matters that I have a rapport with him and that we get on and the interview actually goes ahead. And there's a producer, let's say, who's a woman, and the bloke says, "Oh, who's that nice looking person or whatever?" It's obviously not you, Matt. And so he's making comment on this woman's physical appearance. Now, I find in those circumstances it really difficult to speak up and say, "Hang on, dude, we don't kind of make those sorts of remarks anymore." And I find it difficult, I think, for two reasons. One, awkwardness. Maybe
British.
Yeah, perhaps. Two, I think as well, this word PC is used as a massive sort of pushback against doing the right thing. And people say, "Don't be so PC or over the top." And you might meet plenty of women who think, "Oh, I wouldn't be offended by that." Yeah. And then the final thing is, because there is the risk that the interview collapses. And then they're all bad reasons. How do we get over that so that we do make change happen? And would you expect someone in my position on that sort of level of sexism to intervene?
No is the answer. I wouldn't expect it. I wish that everybody did it, and so it wouldn't make you feel awkward. Because if everybody did it, if it became much more common parlance, the way it's really common for someone to pick up someone's racist language in the pub, if it was as common for people to be like, "Don't talk about your missus," like that sort of thing, then you know, you'd be in a much better position socially. But no, I wouldn't expect you to, because you have to be really careful when you are. If she had heard in your hypothetical situation, see, if that had been me and I'd been your producer and he said that and I had heard, I would just say, "Well, I'm the person who's in charge, who's made all of this happen, and so, you know, let's just focus on that." So you don't have to be like, "God, you're a massive twat." You don't have to be confrontational. Often what I did with one of my constituents once, on the doorstep, she was telling me she wasn't keen on Romanians because she had read in the newspapers that she seemed a perfectly lovely woman. She said, "I'm not keen on the Romanians coming over here because I read in the newspaper that in schools in Romania, they are teaching kids who are going to come over here to shoplift from supermarkets and, like, you know, to make a living." And so she said, "Oh, you know, I'm a bit worried they're going to be robbing." And I said, "Okay, I'm going to repeat back to you what you just said to me." I didn't say, "God, you're a massive racist. Don't be so ridiculous. Everything you read in the newspapers is totally wrong," because she wouldn't have been able to hear me. Actually, she would have just heard that I thought she was stupid. So I said, "I'm going to repeat back to you what you just said to me." And what you just said to me was that you think that in Romania, a quite religious country, in the state school system, they've got a mocked up Tesco and they are teaching children to put Mars bars up their sleeves. And she was like, "Well, when you say it like that, it does sound a bit ridiculous." So I think that you don't have to be confrontational necessarily in those situations. Although the reason you don't want to be confrontational, in fact, in the situation that you have outlined, is because there's a power imbalance and you feel like they're doing you a favour. Favours and hierarchies in works are the quickest and easiest way that bad behaviour happens, because that ultimately you don't want the interview to collapse is ultimately the reason why you wouldn't just be like, all right, mate, she's a professional woman, let's just keep it professional, which there's nothing wrong with you saying that at all. It wouldn't necessarily be confrontation. It wouldn't be, you know,
you could say it almost in a charming way as well.
Yeah, you can say it in a charming way. You can say, oh, well, you know, if only people said that about me at work, but then I guess they wouldn't because I'm a man.
So when you come up against, because you said in the book that you're prepared to lose votes if necessary, to stand up for what you believe in, and your husband has sort of shored you up in that, has backed you. You know, I think you called him at one point and said, "Look, I'm really worried about, you know, I'm going to lose." And he said, "Well, you know, it's not a job. It's not a job you want if you're going to lose it because you stand up for what you believe in, and that includes being an MP."
Yeah.
Because if you're not going to be able to persuade enough people on the ground what you believe in, then what's the point of being an MP?
Yeah, well, totally. What would be the point?
You've given an example of how challenging it can be, or how successfully you rose to that challenge in confronting someone whose support you want, okay, to continue to do your job. And another example is when there were those protests in Birmingham. I covered this at the time, I think, on LBC, when there was some members of a Muslim community there, and I don't know whether you even can talk in terms of Muslim community.
No, he wasn't representing the Muslim community.
Well, certainly, I'm sure it wasn't representative of the Muslim. Certainly wasn't representative of the Muslim community. But even the expression the community is sort of false because it doesn't really exist.
No.
Muslim chap, a British Muslim chap, was protesting against what kids were being taught in schools.
Yeah.
About whether you could have two mums and so forth.
Yeah.
And you went and confronted him, and the cameras caught it, and it obviously went viral, I'm sure. And how difficult are those scenarios? Because you sometimes, what I found as an LBC presenter is I'm often defending people of the Muslim faith against Islamophobes, against idiots who are calling up, and here I was actually having to say, well, on this occasion, first of all, you don't speak for
the whole
British Muslims. But on this occasion, I'm sorry, but you're the bigot.
Yeah, oh, totally. Look, you have to sometimes tread carefully, but don't not tread, is what I would say on that issue. But in that instance, actually, the thing that hurt me the most was not just that there was a small sect of people with abhorrent views. It wasn't just him. There was a group of protesters. It wasn't just, because, I know that bigotry, certainly about LGBT, certainly about the interaction of children with gay people, it's not a new trope, is it? So the fact, it wasn't even that made me so angry. It was the way that it was allowing the world's press to see the Muslim community where I live, that actually I found the reason why I felt like I had to stand up to him was I thought he was hurting both those communities. He was worsening an already horrible situation for British Muslims by sort of essentially acting like a bad clown who didn't want to integrate into British society as the government had passed the law that it should be the case. So he was as if he was above the law, which is exactly the kind of thing that gets written about in right-wing newspapers. Oh, these people think that they're above the law. To me, I see a lot of people who think that they're above the law. They're mainly in the cabinet. And so I just was... and also I'd been into the school. The reason I was there at all is I'd been into the school to see the head teacher, because the night before she had sent me an email to all Birmingham MPs and just said, I feel a little bit like I'm on my own here. I'm under siege and I feel like I need some support. And I went in, and I'd never met her before, Sarah. I'm now very good friends with her. I went into the school first thing in the morning, because it's right next to my house, and she just was desperate. And she was obviously a brilliant teacher and loved her kids. And so there was an element of the minute when I stood in front of him, I was cross. I was deeply, deeply cross. But I knew that if I just shouted and ranted at him, I would just look like him. And so I was trying to express to him, that he was hurting his own community way worse than he was hurting the LGBT community, way worse, that he was doing the most damage to people like him. He didn't care. And he got Katie Hopkins to come along eventually, so, you know.
I don't know what this guy's particular views were, so I was just using that instance as a way of characterising debate on the other side from where you were arguing. And again, he's not here to defend himself. Just quickly, if you could, Jess, give us the blueprint then. I mean, there's so many rough edges and there's so many different ways of doing things, but just broadly speaking, in general terms, if someone wants to change something in the workplace, or maybe even in their social group, but let's stick to the workplace because that's where power
most people.
It's where power can be in tension. So much of sexism, just for example, is about power, is about hierarchy. But how should people go about it? And you're not trying to push people out into the big wide world and say, look, just lose your jobs. Because there's a lot of detail in the book about urging caution and how you build support networks. And a key part of this, of course, with the advent of social media is how properly and responsibly and constructively to use something like Twitter. Because it can backfire very quickly.
Very quickly. So, I mean, essentially the blueprint is check your motivation, make a plan of exactly what you are hoping to achieve and what you absolutely won't give up on. But some of the things, expect change to be less radical than it was when you started the plan, I think is probably true, because things, you know, we all have to mould ourselves a bit. The most important thing is don't ever do it on your own. Don't ever do it on your own. It will burn you out. There are lots and lots of different sort of support groups, support networks for various things. If you were talking about work, whether it's the union movement, whether it's like a network within your workplace or just other work colleagues who are in the same boat as you, don't do it on your own, because it's basically easy to pick people off when they're on their own. It's much harder to do it when they're not, but also just for your own sanity. It's very, very lonely. It can be very, very lonely trying to change something on your own. And you start to think that you're wrong. You'll start to reflect and go, oh, maybe everybody else is right and I'm wrong about this. Protect yourself as best you can, but know that it is always a risk if you're going to speak up about something at work, and try and mitigate as many of those risks as possible with good note-taking and good evidence base and backup, and enjoy it. Genuinely try and imagine how you'll feel at the end if you manage to do it, how proud you'll feel. Sometimes I see things like the statue of Millicent Fawcett in Parliament Square, and I think, well, I was part of making that happen. And I said that to my son once when we were in Parliament Square. And I feel really proud that, you know, that we were part of a coalition of voices trying to push for it and get it to happen quickly. I said to my son, oh, you know, I did some of that. And he was like, oh, what you mean, like you made some of it? And I was like, no, very disappointing. Like, I just sat in a lot of meetings. I didn't whittle it out of stone or anything. I'm not cool like Dad. I just sat in lots of meetings. But focus on that. Imagine what it would be like to win a change that you'd always thought which should be the case, and just how good it feels, because it is like better than any drug I've ever taken.
We're running out of time on that bombshell, but you make the point in the book, and it's a depressing point, and it's something that people need to be aware of as they sort of take on institutions and hierarchies, is that power likes to protect power. Yes. And the system, in a way, is geared to protecting the powerful. One of the things you want to do is try to make sure that everyday people do get out there, that more people do try to get involved in politics, appreciating, of course, not everybody will want to, but try to prevent a world in which the same old people wear the same old suits.
Absolutely. I mean, often it gets sort of talked about, like sort of running for political office or taking part in political activism. People are quite cynical about it at the moment. It's quite easy to be sort of cynical about clicktivism and all of that. But when you hear that cynicism, just hear that the people, and I've been cynical myself because I'm somebody who has power now, just be wary that the reason people are cynical about that sort of thing is because they don't want you to have any, they don't want to share the power. So it is deeply important that people take part, not in politics, like party politics, if that's not your bag, but make sure that in your local area, if there's decisions to be made, the right decisions won't be made unless you're there. And the people who actually live in those places, in the book I use the example of Grenfell. If Kensington Council had been made up entirely of people who lived in Grenfell Tower, I don't think they'd have had that cladding on there. But they didn't. It wasn't made up of those people. And that is the most perfect example that you could give.
And it goes back to the American Revolution or the American War of Independence, doesn't it? No taxation without representation. And it's
Absolutely.
part of why diversity matters across the public sphere, but also
Absolutely.
the corporate sphere.
Laima Gaboui, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for what was a huge peace strike in Liberia, which was led by women and tried by women. There was a whole thing about like a sex ban until the war was over and things. But she said, when sort of challenged, well, not everybody can rise to high office and everything. She led this grassroots movement, and she said, what is the single greatest thing that will change things for women in the world? And she said, more women in positions of power is the single thing.
You point out that people can surprise themselves, because everyone, I think you asked about this in the book, or maybe you're making a generalized point about people who do brave things. They don't consider themselves brave, but if they heard of it being done by someone else, they would immediately say, oh, that was really brave.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Every single person I interviewed for the book, some of them remarkable and courageous people who I just couldn't catch my breath at how they, Zelda at 25 standing up in front of the entire sort of movie world and saying, I will not tolerate this, to Harvey Weinstein. I find that remarkably brave. And when I say it to her, she's like, you're joking, I'm a wreck. She's like, oh, little me. Oh, I've got to go out to the field and put the sheep out. She doesn't see herself like that. And every single one of the people who had done anything amazing, when I said it, they were like, oh, no, I didn't do it on my own. Oh, it wasn't just me. People love to give away their brilliance. But I feel like if I see a woman running down the road, I think, oh, power to your bloody elbow. And then I think, oh, I'd like to go out for a run. And I said, God, what if anyone saw me running? But when I see that, I think it's amazing. But in myself, I can't convince myself that I wouldn't just look a fool. We're funny creatures.
Well, just to finish, just very finally, a couple of very quick questions about you. I mean, do you see yourself as brave? Because a lot of the work that you do is outspoken. You've taken on your own party, you've taken on the government, you've taken on protesters. I mean, you strike me as fearless, and this is in the awful shadow, but also perhaps inspired by your late friend Jo Cox. So, do you feel yourself, if you're really honest, do you feel brave, or is this just a calling that you have to answer?
I think it's probably a bit of both. I do feel brave now, actually. I do feel like I am a brave person. But that was sort of given to me in my childhood, if I'm honest. I'm the youngest of my family, and I'm the only girl. So I've got 3 older brothers, and my mum and dad definitely really pushed me to do, and climb up to the top of something. They weren't nervous. They were like, look, the boys are doing it, you do it too. So I was sort of grafted as a brave person in childhood, but I'm certainly not fearless. When I do something brave, when I stood in front of that protester, when I tweeted anything that was against my own political party, I can feel it in my chest. I feel frightened. I'm not frightened of public speaking and things like that because of practice. But when I take a risk, I feel scared, but I quite like it. I quite like it. So
that brings me to my very last question then, which is just about your motivation. Because you're so driven and have been for so long, perhaps all your life, by bad good, by helping make the world a little bit of a better place.
Mm-hmm.
But we live in this world of social media, of ego, of echo chamber, of playing to the gallery, of going viral, all of those sorts of things. And there are temptations out there. I mean, I feel them myself as a journalist. It's part of my currency in a way. How do you avoid falling foul of your own motivation test? How do you make sure that you're not doing it because, I mean, I know what sort of tweet will get retweeted. I'm sort of gradually learning how Twitter works, and that can encourage you down rabbit holes.
That's terrible.
It's like national columnists. You know, they can sometimes become caricatures of themselves. So how do you avoid that?
You don't always avoid it. I have an ego just like anybody else. I think the greatest lie that ever gets told is that you shouldn't care what people think about you. And we all still say it to our children, and it's ridiculous. I really care what people think about me. I want to be liked. I quite like being popular. I don't mind being hated, so that's good as well. But I will many times in my career fall foul of it. I will fall foul of it, but if as long as then when I get to work the motivation is not retweets, it is this bit of legislation has got to change so migrant women have somewhere to live by next week. As long as you are doing enough of the other side, I think it's okay. If you become just an opinion with no practical action that does anything to help anyone else, even just one other person, if you are just an opinion, and if the motivation for that opinion is to hurt somebody else for your own ends, then you've gone too far. But absolutely, I know exactly what you mean. There are certain tweets that I know I can put out and it will, I didn't used to, but I've got a radar for it now. And sometimes it's too delicious to, I'm only human.
Jess Phillips, it's been such good fun. It's been a real pleasure and a real privilege to speak to you. I'm so glad you joined us at the Harrogate Literature Festival. Absolutely amazing. And your book, Truth to Power, is just that, and it's available in paperback. Thank you so much.
No worries, my pleasure.
And thank you to everyone who's joined us. Lots more events through the weekend. Thank you so much.